All right, John. Okay, so I'll get started. So I kind of chatted a little bit. I'm very happy to be with you guys because I've been several times to Kajaani. I think maybe 4 or 5 times. Uh, I gave a masterclass or two of them. I contributed to the developers conference there. I was even part of the Cavio cluster. So I've been there. A good 4 or 5 times. I just love it, and I just can't wait to return. So that's why I'm so happy to be with you today. So today I will start with a kind of brief lecture on one aspect of game design, which is often, underrated, but it is important. And then we'll conclude with a question and answer sessions where you guys can ask me absolutely any questions on game design and the game industry in general. So first of all, game design, and I'm sure you know that, is not only about game mechanics, controls, or user interface, or game modes. No, game design, it's also about data. Lot of data. By the way, can you see my screen? Can you see my lecture? Okay, all right, yes. So as I say, game design, and this is something that you guys have to be aware of that, if you're a game designer, Excel is just going to be your best friend. Excel, the spreadsheet, is going to be your best friend. So this example is taken from a simple racing game I've done a few years ago, and I insist on that. It was a simple racing game. And that's just one tab among the 6 or 7 tabs that I had in my Excel spreadsheet. So that data can be used for many things, for tuning and balancing whatever you have in the games, weapon, vehicles, abilities, you just name it. Like in that example, I use those charts to balance vehicle within their group and to make sure that each group was significantly better than the previous one. That was the main use of data in that game. Data can also be used to build and control difficulty curves. Like I used, you see the left curve, I used it to balance the level design in Alone in the Dark, The New Nightmare. I worked on that game a long time ago. And I used the right chart to build the difficulty curve as I was building levels for a platform game. So you see data, it's used in many, many instances. And also, data can be used to define prices of items that you will sell in soft currency. So this graph shows the purchasing price of light French tanks in World of Tanks. So, and of course, that's the topic of today, is the data can be used to build players' progression. So this chart is taken from Cartoon. It's a Mario Kart-like game I designed a few years ago. So this is kind of the ideal progression, fast during the early days and much more time consuming later on. On the horizontal axis, you've got the days the player is playing. And on the vertical axis, you've got the levels, they reach. And we've got here 3 curves because it depends on, how much the player is playing. So I will come back to that a little bit later. So, of course, one could argue that it's pointless to define games data before launch because we have no idea how players will play the game. This is true. But we must define data even if we know that we'll adjust them later on. Why? Because first, data is going to define at what speed players will progress and how fast they will get rewards. And if you have unbalanced metrics from the very start, this is going to warp players' feedback. They'll be too impatient, or on the contrary, they'll be bored. And second, players could also get mad if the cost of acquiring items change a lot, or if their progression on earnings are erased, a few months after launch. So for those two reasons, even if you know that once the game is launched, you will change data, it's good, to start with data which are kind of more or less, where they should be. Now, what kind of data, we'll be talking about? So I'll talk about players' progression because this is probably the first set of data to define because it's a backbone of many games that rely on players' progression. And they rely on players' progression for their long-term engagement and therefore their monetization for mobile games. So to be clear, in my definition, and I think that's everybody's definition, players progression describes what item players will unlock and the conditions to do so as as they play the game. So as I explained early on, ideally players should not progress at the same pace. Initially, we want them to progress fast so we can spoil them with many rewards. So fast progression, but later on, progression must be slower to drive them to play a lot. That's the general strategy. And actually, this is what you witness nearly everywhere. So the ideal progression is fast in early stages of the game and slows down as players spend more time in the game. That's the basic. Now, and now we're going to see some tools, some techniques. So let's assume that in our example, players need to reach XP thresholds, experience points thresholds, in order to unlock new levels. So XP is the value we want to compute for each level. And in my example, levels are called a threshold. So let's talk about mathematical approach to build this progression curve. First, we have what we call the linear progression. So we increase the value of every threshold with a fixed amount. So those are the data, and that's a curve. So clearly this is bad, because it's going to take players the same amount to reach level 10 or to reach level 2. So progression can be too slow early on or too fast later on. So clearly, this curve, it's bad. Let's forget about it. Then we have what we call the exponential curve. And here, the value of each new threshold results from the multiplication of the previous value by a fixed coefficient. Like in this example, I multiply the previous value by a coefficient of 1.4. Okay? So that's the kind of curve we are getting. That's already more interesting, isn't it? It's kind of starting really slow, you don't need much XP to reach new level, and then, you need more and more and more. Okay, this is pretty interesting, because it makes it possible to offer, as I said, easy to reach early objectives and to make later objectives more difficult to reach, but it can make the last objective way too hard to reach. So this curve, it's better than the linear curve, but still far from being ideal. So let's discover now what is called the linear increase curve. Now here, the increase between each threshold is linear. You see? It's increasing, by +1 every time. And that's how the curve looks like. Okay, so it looks like the previous one, but the end is not as steep, because when you compare them all, you see, this is the best curve because it makes it possible to offer thresholds that are increasingly challenging, okay, to reach without making the later one impossible. You see, this tool is generate the red curve, which is clearly less steep than the other one. So this, if you want to use mathematical approach to compute the place progression, this is probably, the right technique to use. This one, linear increase curve. Now, the problem is that this is not going to prevent later thresholds to become unreachable. And it doesn't help us control the time it takes to reach them. So we need to control how much time it's going to take players to reach later thresholds in order to avoid excessive time. If players spend too much time to reach next thresholds, chances are that they will give up. They will lose patience. So using time to control players' progression is probably, in my view, the best strategy to follow. Okay. So that's just what I was saying. So a solution, and to me it's the best solution, even better than the mathematical approach, is to compute thresholds on the basis of how long it will take for players to reach them. You see? The thing I had to do that. And to explain that, I'm just going to show you a small example. So again, our goal is to define how many experience points we need to reach at each threshold. And also we need to control the time it takes average players to reach them. So let's take an example of a very simple car racing game where players can upgrade 3 components of the machine: the engine, the brakes, and the tires. Okay. Again, the example I've prepared, it's very, very simple. So you guys understand the design strategy. And then obviously, once you will use that, it's up to you to beef it up, to make it more sophisticated. But to understand the concept, I'm making it on purpose very, very simple. So remember, if we have a progression in any game, there's a purpose, okay? And it should serve also a purpose from the player's point of view. So in my case, in this example, I decide that the progression will benefit players by unlocking upgrades. So players achieve progression by earning XP, and XP are earned by playing the game. Very simple stuff, okay? Very classical. I also decide, as the designer of this hypothetical project, that each component can receive 4 upgrades that I call Engine 1, Engine 2, Engine 3, and Engine 4, okay? Those are the upgrades. So we've got 12 upgrades in total in this very simplistic example. Now, as again, the designer of this project, I make the following choice. I want players, to be able to unlock numerous upgrades early on, okay? And later upgrades must take much more time, so this is very classical. I want also early upgrades to focus on the engine and later upgrades to focus on the brakes. Why? Because remember, early on, I want to get players excited by the progression. And in racing games, players usually, are more thrilled to upgrade the engine than their brakes, okay? Because obviously they say, well, with the engine, I'm going to go faster, and so on. So to them, it sounds like better rewards. So on purpose, I decide that through my progression, I want players to essentially upgrade engines first. And then also, that's my choice as a designer. I want an average player to unlock the last upgrade after 21 days of daily gaming. Again, if you were to do this exercise for a real game, you would probably have much more days, okay? But I'm doing it, just as an example. Okay, so those are design choices, okay? Okay. So the first step is to define in which order upgrades will be available. And I call it what I call the schedule of introduction. So you can see it, you've got the level. So this chart tells me that when the player reaches level 1, he unlock the upgrade engine 1. When the players will reach level 2, they will unlock the tire 1 upgrade and so on. So you see, when you look at it, you've got 3 engine upgrades within level 1 to 6, okay? And the brake upgrades tend to be available later on. Again, that reflects my choice, as the game designer. All right, this is the first step to do, to build this schedule of introduction. Second, I must define how many XP players will earn on average. So in this example, I've made the following design choices, is that players earn 100 XP for every race completed. So this is very simple, obviously. And also I define that players can do 5 races every day. Like in some games like CSR racing, I'm sure you know the game, you've got fuel points, which limits, the number of races you can do every day. So as a result, players can earn, if they race 5 times a day, they can play 500 XP a day. So obviously, I insist this is a very simple example for teaching purpose. In a real life situation, you would probably grant different amount of XP to players depending on their performance in the race. For instance, you would grant 100 XP for the player that has reached that arrived first in the race, 100 XP to the second player, and 80 for the last player. Okay, so that would lead to 3 different progression curves. Okay, but this is fine as long as they're not too different from each other. And of course, you can adjust the number of races played every day by players. Skilled players being more likely to do more race than less skilled players. So that means that when you will actually, try to estimate how many XP players will earn, then probably, you would do more than one curve. You would do one curve for like a hardcore, not hardcore, but players who play the game, a lot. So those players most likely would play as many races as possible, and they would be pretty skilled. And then you would have, other players who would play maybe the 2 or 3 races a day and are not very skilled. So you see, that's why in my previous chart, you saw 3 progression curves. They depends on what I call the player's profile. So that's how, you can make it more sophisticated. The key is that to make sure that no matter, what the player's profiles are, you don't want too much differences between, the different players' profile in terms of earning. So here again, to make it simple, I estimate that on average, my players will earn 500 XP a day. Step 3 is to compute the total amount of XP that players will earn over X days. In my case, 21 days, So in this example, as I said, I limited myself to 21 days. So it's very simple. On the first day, my player will earn 500 XP, on the second one, 1,000 and so on, Very simple. Okay. Now in step 4, I decide when I want players to reach the threshold. Now that's an important point. Remember, one of the things I want to do with this technique is that I want to make sure that the right amount of time is spent by players before they reach the next threshold. So here, I decide that, for instance, level 1 should be reached on the very first day, the day that players discover the game the first time. Then level 2 should be available, should be unlocked on the day 2, okay? Level 3 should also be achievable on day 2 and so on, okay? But then you see later on, like level 7, you need to reach for day 14, to reach it and so on. So you can clearly see that early on, during the first days of gameplay, players will unlock levels very fast, okay? So therefore they will unlock new upgrades. And later on, it will take much, much more days of gameplay to reach later levels. Again, remember, I want players to level up fast during their first days of play, and I want them to take much more time after the early period. So that's the kind of curve, I want to have. Now, since I know how many XP my players will earn over time, it becomes easy for me to compute how many XP they need to earn in order to reach a given threshold. And this is step 5. So you can see that in order to reach, so it's kind of small on the screen for me. So like in order, to reach like level 5, you need to reach 3,000. You need to earn in total 3,500 XP. Very simple to compute, again, because this example is very simple. Okay. So, but this is what some basic math can give you. But in the real life, in practice, you need to adjust some thresholds by hand. For instance, in my example, I decided that 400 XP should be enough for players to unlock threshold 1 on the first day of play. Why? Because I want to make sure that most players, even those that do only a few races, will unlock new content. So you see here, when I say less, that means that I request less XP. More means that I want more XP than what is computed by the formula. And that's how you can define it. And the result, that's my progression curve, you see, which tells you for each threshold how many XP you want players to earn. So the benefit of this technique, I think you can clearly see it, is that you have a good idea, of how long it's going to take for players to reach new thresholds. And remember, if they go too slowly, they get bored. If they go too fast, then they eventually they will reach the end, and you won't have anything else to give them. So finding the right speed of progression is very, very important. So this example covers 21 days of play only. Now, what about much longer period? Now, usually progression schemes are built over months, sometimes years of play, okay? So the good practice is to stabilize by hand the number of XP needed to reach much, much later thresholds, like in this one. So you see, initially here you've got a curve a bit similar to the one I just showed you, okay? But eventually, I kind of smooth it out, So I still have some kind of slow progression, okay? But, I decide that I don't want, to make it unbearable for players. So eventually, I kind of smooth out, my curve. Again, it's done by hand, but this way, you have full control about what will happen in your game. Now, of course, you've got players who are going to try to speed run your game, and they could break your progression strategy. Now, how to deal with them? Now, it depends on the kind of game you have. If it's a game, it's a free-to-play. There's no problem if they use real money, to speed run, because eventually our goal is to monetize our players anyway. Okay, so that's okay. But if it's not a free-to-play, now how can we control them? Well, there are different techniques. The first strategy is to artificially limit the playtime. Like I used in my example. In my example, players can only do 5 races a day. Okay, so that's kind of one way to limit it. It's okay if you're targeting casual players or eventually mid-core. If you are targeting, like real gamers, don't do that. Okay, but this strategy is quite acceptable for people, are kind of more casual-minded. Good example is Cityville. In Cityville, players are limited by what they call energy points. So, as I said, pool is suited for mid-core to hardcore gamers. Another strategy is to limit their XP earnings once they have reached a daily cap. For instance, in Make Arena, which is a mobile game, it's a multiplayer game, so it's kind of mid-core to a hardcore. It's a 5 versus 5, a pretty intense combat game. So there's a feature that they call point boost. Okay, so it doubles combat points earned after each round of combat, but they work for a limited number of points earned during a time period. And once players have used their quota, they cannot double their earning anymore. So it's a pretty smart way they did. You can still play as much as you want. You can play as many games as you want. But after a certain number of games, your earning will drastically decrease. So I think it's a pretty smart way, to control the number of XP. They call them, combat points, the number of combat points to control that. And another strategy yet is to allow players to play as much as they want, but in World of Tanks, they found a nice way around it. In that game, when players acquire more powerful tanks or when they upgrade the tanks, the matchmaking features pit them against equally powerful players. So players can speedrun the game, the progression as much as they want. It will not get them any benefit because they'll be facing players who have equally powerful tanks, you see. So I like this example because World of Tanks is really a hardcore game. It's very difficult. It's a great game. And clearly, they don't want to limit the players' playtime, but they found this, they use the matchmaking to make sure that even if you speedrun, you won't get any advantage in this competitive game. So that's a brief way, for me to introduce how to build a progression. I hope I've been very practical. We call that quantitative design. It's being used in many, many studios. I've shown you examples that I personally use, for level design, for a game system and so on. Many companies do that. So again, Excel or any spreadsheet is your best friend. So don't hesitate to dive in. Start very small. Okay, start with a very simple example. You'll never be able to, to emulate real life. Okay, so you have to be aware that whatever model you design, whatever mathematical model you use, it will just be like a far cry from the reality. But that's okay, because it's better than nothing. Okay, so use those kind of models. Use quantitative design. It will greatly help you, especially if you got progression system or any kind of need to balance things out. Just to conclude, I published a few months ago my first online course. It's on the Udemy platform. So it's focused on the fundamentals of game design. So maybe you don't need that, of course, but if you know people around you who, needs, to learn the basics of game design, and I'm trying to be very practical, there's almost no theory, well, please feel free, to share with them this QR code. It will take you to a link, and the link offers like a 25% discount on the course. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. Now I'm open, for questions on any topics.